Welcome, movie fans, to Popcorn Talk Network's Anatomy of a Movie. I'm your host, Demetri Panos, and today, well, gather around the campfire, everybody, because today we're going to be talking about scary movies to tell in the dark. Mwah. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Popcorn Talk, featuring movie discussion, news, and interviews. Popcorn Talk, we talk movies. And now, here's Popcorn Talk's Anatomy of a Movie.
Hey, welcome, movie fans. Again, this is Demetri Panos, your host for Popcorn Talk Network's Anatomy of a Movie. Welcome. And yes, we are back. Please do check out our pilot, I guess our pilot show, or our Rise of the Phoenix show that happened about a week or so ago. It goes into all the explanation as to what brought it back, but I can share with you that it was in no small part because of you, the fans in the audience. You really asked for it. I never wanted it to go away. Look at that. That's for you. That's for you. And I would be remiss if I didn't introduce to you the man behind the curtain, Ryan. How are you, buddy?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Good. I appreciate you producing and engineering the show today.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.
And very excited today to talk about scary stories to tell in the dark. So first up, a quick review to talk about the movie. Should know that Anatomy of a Movie has always been spoilerific. So if you haven't seen the movie, you may want to just put us on pause.
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
There we go. Red alert, shields up.
Spoiler alert.
So yes, I will talk about plot. I can tell you right off the top, there aren't like huge twists in this movie that I really will need to dive into. But if you are the person that likes to go in completely cold, just put me on pause and then come back and then be part of the discussion. And being part of the discussion is a major thing where you can on YouTube give your comments, and we'll talk about that towards the end. So first up, scary stories to tell in the dark. Look, it's made for the uninitiated to horror. It's a primer, so to speak. That doesn't make it any less of a horror movie for the true fans of the horror genre. And the movie delivers an atmosphere, ghosts, creeps, and scares, and fun. It's just the kind of cinema that may have influenced a young little lad, Guiermo Del Torro, to be the great storyteller that he is today. So Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, if you didn't know, it's based off of the popular young adult horror series written by Alvin Schwartz. The movie anthologizes some of Schwartz's favorite stories and puts them into one expedient narrative. So you're not necessarily seeing an anthology movie like a Twilight Zone or a Creepshow. It is one simple narrative, but there are different stories in which the movie tells. So, and the story takes place in a relatively sleepy town, Mill Valley. It is 1968, and it's Halloween. And with the draft casting a gloomy fog over the teenage locals, three of which are getting ready for what may be their last Halloween together. So along with their tricks and treats, they meet Ramon, who's just driving through town and has a penchant for Night of the Living Dead. The group dare to explore the town's infamously creepy haunted house, the cobwebbed former home of the reportedly murderous Sarah Bellows. Stella discovers a hidden cellar where the lore goes Sarah Bellows was forced to live in, and where she wrote stories of the macabre with her own blood as ink. So Stella finds the book, and the cursed proves to have a colossal supernatural powers, and almost immediately the book changes their fates, and one by one, our beloved characters, they find themselves living out the story Sarah Bellows chooses to tell. Harold, the Big Toe, the Red Spot, and more. These are all stories that were written as books, and each is inexorably summoned to do battle with their own uniquely terrified deeds. So Director André Øvredal, he really nicely captures the setting, the time period, and the atmosphere. I mean, Mill Valley itself it's basically any town USA. It has its own main street, its country farms, and the time period of 1969 and it being Halloween. Øvredal really does capture that feel, that spirit. It feels like fall, and it feels like it's Halloween time. It's very much like the setting of a scary story. So each story delivers on the chill and scary factor, the creepy factor. You got angry scarecrows, walking corpses trying to find missing appendages. I mean, these are the tropes that nightmares are made from. So it should be no surprise that the master of telling ghost stories, Guillermo del Toro, is involved in this movie. And we're going to get into his involvement in a little bit. But he was a fan of the books. And let me tell you, his fingerprints are really all over this movie. Damaged characters, vengeful ghost creepies and crawlies. So, but I want to make no mistake, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is no devil's backbone. Here, Guillermo del Toro gets to have fun. He and Øvredal are campfire storytellers, weaving tales as if you're on your own personal dark ride. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark isn't meant to scare the bejesus out of you. The movie just wants to make you jump a little and sink into your seat a bit. And that's the fun of horror, isn't it? It doesn't have to be too intense to scare. It can keep suspense with just the flashlight on and make you jump when it clicks off. And that is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So going and talking about this movie, as I said, it was based off of series of books, and that's a great picture of Guillermo del Toro. It was based off of these series of books that Alvin Schwartz wrote. Now, personally, the books came out in the 80s. By then, I was a full-fledged horror fan, but I had kind of moved on. At that point, I was already reading Stephen King, Peter Straub, Dean Koontz. Ryan, how about yourself? Were you familiar with the books? Did you hear about the books? Had you read any of the books?
I've heard about these stories and these books. I myself had never. I don't think I didn't hit that age group to read them in time. My age group was more like Goosebumps. Still did Stephen King. I'm a huge Stephen King fan, so I just missed the marker on this one for I believe my age group. But I have heard of them. They are really well renowned and famous.
They're very well renowned and famous, and in some places even banned, which really surprised the heck out of me. So yeah, and the way that director Øvredal explains how he literally approached Scary Stories. He wanted it to mix between horror tale and an ode to the Amblin adventures that he grew up loving. So you had these very well grounded, funny, real characters battling evil forces of fables and monsters. So kind of has a Monster Squad appeal to it, although Monster Squad deals with the universal classic horror monsters, and that was really more fun. I believe Scary Stories is a little bit scarier than Monster Squad, but I'm a huge fan of Monster Squad, and I'm a pretty decent fan of this movie as well. So working with, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was such a hit, and this is from the author. Again, I was really kind of unawares, but these books, I mean, he comes out with Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Then there were more Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Then Scary Stories 3, more stories to chill your bones. And so they were originally illustrated by a gentleman by the name of Caldecott Medal and artist Stephen Gamble. And the stories came to life not only in words, but they had these unapologetically hideous ink drawings in which Guillermo del Toro himself was actually bought some of the original artwork that he has hanging up amongst his offices and home. So, going to Guillermo del Toro, talk about him for a little bit. He's always been a monster movie fan. And if you have followed his career, whether it be The Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth, or even Hellboy, he always deals with these creatures and ghosts. There was Crimson Peak, which I felt and still do today. It's an amazing ghost story that he put together. And then, of course, The Shape of Water, which focuses more on romance. But he's always been fascinated by creatures, and he always looks at them as metaphors for what humans try their best to hide away, and who believes scary stories are vital to children's forming psyches. And which is very, very, very interesting, because you see those themes, as I mentioned before, in those movies. And that's why I believe this one's like an intermediate, it's like a bridge. Even if you're not really into horror, you can watch this movie and it might inspire you to get into a lot more and watch a lot more horror. That's what I found to be the true fun of this movie. And Guillermo del Toro looks at horror in that way, that it can be fun. And here's something, Ryan, that I'll share with you. I watched the movie at a screening earlier this week, and surprise guest, we had the director, Øvredal, and Guillermo del Toro.
Wow.
Yes, it was pretty awesome. And from the man himself, Del Toro did explain that this was a primer, that this movie was meant to scare a little, but he wanted audiences who may not normally see horror to, at the very least, have fun. So he very much had an influence in getting this book done. So Del Toro started with the idea of supernatural book that writes itself. So how do you encompass, how do you put in about 4 stories into a movie that has a through line narrative and not make it like an anthology? Well, they made a structure, and it's this book. It's this book that writes itself. Number one, I think the concept of the book being written in this girl's blood because she didn't have ink, it's really cool. And you can go back to, you can reference that to like The Evil Dead, the Book of the Damned, which is also written in blood. And there are other horror movies that use that trope, but it's used to good effect here in this movie, because it's not so much that the reader reads the book, it's the book reads the reader and finds its darkest fear, and hence we get the creatures that were so popular in the books, and they're put into the movies. You had a picture up. I believe one of them was the poster of Harold. Harold is this scarecrow, and it was one of the. To me, it was a great. It was a great character, a great creature, a really great monster. And what's really cool, I thought, about this movie is that, you know, when you watch an anthology movie, and Ryan, I'm sure you've watched an anthology movie or two, right?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Even last year with Buster Scruggs. That was
right.
A great anthology film. But it's just the right director, the right filmmaker that can make it entertaining the whole ride. Yeah.
Absolutely. But, you know, even when you're watching movies like Creepshow or A Twilight Zone or A Cat's Eye, for example, you know, there's two or three stories that are like really good. There's one story that's excellent that would stay usually save for the end. What precedes it is pretty good, and then there's one that's okay. This one, I felt that the monsters, each creature was as equally scary as Harold. Like, my big fear was that after Harold, we'd have nothing to live up to Harold because he was so fully realized. But no, the movie does carry out, and each of the other stories I found were as creepy, and in some cases even creepier than our Scarecrow Harold. So Del Toro did start with the books, obviously, but he also felt that the best way to do this is do this framework. Apparently, the book was not in the movie or even the Sarah Bellows, but this is a great way. It was what connected everything and connected our characters. So, which I thought to be really, really very smart idea. And in fact, the legend of Sarah Bellows was inspired by a single sentence that Del Toro uttered, which became the hinge of the entire film. And that is, stories can hurt and stories can heal. And that idea inspired them to write Sarah as a woman who is harmed by stories that are malicious, stories that are lies, stories that drive her to become the monster people say she is. So I really found that to be quite fascinating. And that is a theme that runs throughout the movie. So, and the characters, the kids, they're teenage kids in 1969. In 1969, there was just a tiny bit of turmoil happening in the country. And the movie reflects that. And again, saying it could be their last Halloween together, not because of the dangers and the horrific peril that they're about to encounter, but a few of them are about to could potentially be drafted and then not come back. So that is an overlying, that is the fog I was talking about regarding the draft. So the Eerie director, Øvredal, or André Øvredal, he has and Ryan, you may have watched this because I know you are a huge Netflix person, but he did Troll Hunters.
Oh yeah, Troll Hunters. I saw that a few years ago.
Yeah, he did that.
Really
he did that.
Fascinating use of. It made me think about the budget for that movie because they accomplish a lot with a little.
Right.
And that's what I hope he did with this movie.
Well, you bring up a good point. You bring up a really valid point because the budget on this movie, I would have to look it up, but it's not a hugely budgeted movie. I would say that it most likely is around something that you might see a Blumhouse movie. I would be extremely surprised if it
was around 25 million.
Okay, I was going to say I'd be surprised that if it was 20 million, but yeah, 25 million isn't extraordinary. But it doesn't really show in this movie. I really think that from a technical standpoint, I thought that the movie worked, and I didn't look at it as being a cheap B movie. In fact, it reminded me of two other horror movies. It reminded me of this one movie called The Lady in White, which starred a very young Lucas Haas. And it's a really fantastic ghost story. It's a period piece as well. But Scary Stories here kind of captures a similar feel and tone. And it just worked. I don't believe that's the same Lady in White. This one was Katherine Hellman was the Lady in White. And it's and Lucas Haas was in it, and it's a really good ghost story. If you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. And then the other movie it kind of reminded me of was Trick or Treat, which I'm sure a lot more of you have seen. Trick or Treat to me is near masterpiece, and it's something I watch every Halloween time in October. But you understand what I'm talking about. You've seen the movie, that it has this feel to it, this feel of autumn, this feel of Halloween with each story that's presented to you, even though it time shifts, where Scary Stories does not, but it does follow the various groups of characters. I think that Trick or Treat is more an anthology-ish kind of a movie than Scary Stories is, and I'm not saying that Scary Stories is better than Trick or Treat, or even necessarily The Lady in White, but it at least grabs the tone and feel of that Halloween spirit and time. So that's what I really enjoyed the most. So I want to talk a little bit too about the VFX, since we were talking about budget. So for Øvredal, this was literally his first time working with practical monsters on this level. So they tried to stay away from doing a lot of digital effects, although Harold himself has to have somewhat of a digital effect, and I would say much of the other monsters and ghosts there, but they tried to stay practical as much as possible. So they had a veteran makeup effects and creature sculptor called Norman Cabrera. He first actually worked with Del Toro on Hellboy, and for Scary Stories, Del Toro invited him to create two of the most iconic creatures from the collection, Harold, the Scarecrow, and the Toeless Corpse. So regarding Harold, Cabrera began by casting an actor by the name of Mark Steger. He cast his head, so which is pretty cool. And he had a relationship with Mark playing monsters in other movies. And I know that he's an amazing performer, and this is from Cabrera. So we started by making a cast of him, and then we sculpted the features of Harold over his face, constantly turning it around and looking at it from every possible angle. And as it came to life with Mark, it was really cool. And I do have to say, Harold is featured in the trailer, and it is one creepy ass Scarecrow, probably one of the creepier Scarecrows that I've seen in horror movies. And the way that his walk is really kind of creepy as well. Yeah, it delivered. He was the first monster to appear technically on screen to play out his story, and it was really cool. So the next one that they worked on, the Big Toe, and again, this is a character that is seen in the movie, and this is more or less a zombie type corpse, and looking for her big toe, which ended up in some semblance of a stew that one of our misfortunate characters was dipping into a little bit as it was his supper. And this creepy character limping through the house saying, "Where is my toe?" is actually, it was good. It was really scary, and it delivers a good it delivered a good punch. One thing to know too that I found very interesting is that the stories within this narrative, each of them had like their own beginning, middle, and end. So they were short stories within a larger structure. And fascinatingly enough, they played out as stories, and they have a beginning. There is definitely a middle part to each one, and then there's an end. And you as the movie-going audience, as well as the characters who are trying to save their friends, are going through, like, there's almost like a time crunch. I mean, and although it's not written on the screen, they're trying to get from A to B to maybe save their friends from a fate that nobody would want. So, but the Big Toe. So Norman here really followed Gamel's artwork, and so they used Javier Botet, who portrayed the skeletal toeless corpse. So it was an actual actor. And so this led to using Javier as a performer. He was a performer from Spain who was incredibly thin and helped us to make the corpse look like a living cadaver. And it does. And I think you've seen the movie, you would agree, and it's taken right from the story pages of the books. So, and then there was actually another one of my unsettling scenes was this pale lady. She appeared in the Schwartz books, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and they made it as accurate and as detailed as how it was explained and drawn in the book, which is really cool. And creating something about her really spoke to me. And the way she looks like a nice older lady, to me, I looked at her as this really disgustingly bloated, as if had drowned in a lake and had been pulled up, say, like 3 weeks later, who walks very slow, but has the wave and the come on over here so I can hug you of a mother or a grandmother. Again, it was a really creepy part of the movie, I felt, and that's it right there. Yeah, Ryan, you nailed it. And really just so distorted and bloated, and it was, again, I felt it was a very good story, a creepy tale that we got to go through. So, and then, of course, we have a pale lady, which we were talking about. Then the jangly man is another popular one. And the jangly man is just, well, he's exactly that. It's a person that can metamorphosize and bend or contort into any way to get out of any space possible. And it is attacking with a vengeance. Probably the character that, outside of Sarah Bellows, has the most vengeance in going after somebody in the movie. And again, I found it to be somewhat creepy and scary. I thought that the characters, the creatures, worked. And in part, as I always say in horror, why does it work? Because I actually kind of cared for the characters to a decent extent. I wanted to see these teenagers make it through. I think a major mistake in horror movies is when you're writing for teenagers, or adults for that matter, and you don't care about them when they're going up against a horrific foe, you don't necessarily care. And if they're written with some semblance of depth, when they're out trying to run for their lives, you actually kind of care for them. And I found that to be something here as well. So I had mentioned in my review about this haunted house. And there is a haunted house. How can you have a Halloween ghost story without a haunted house in this Anytown, USA? So they found during the production was unearthing a pitch-perfect stand-in for this mansion in a former Victorian oil town in Ontario, Canada, no less. And it was the location manager who found this amazing house in a little town called Petrolia, and just outside of Toronto. And when we entered it and we went inside, it was as fantastical. Øvredal says it was as fantastical inside as it was outside, and it almost felt like the house was created to be this haunted house in the movie. So the house was built at a home in 1890, and it was by a family of wealthy industrialists. In the movie, the ghosts were wealthy industrialists who lived in this house, and they commissioned the structure to echo the Richardsonian Romanesque style, the grand and imposing take of Gothic architecture deemed up by Henry Hobson Richardson. So the house was so intriguing that the production designer set out to recreate the interiors of the house so that they would have, of course, more flexible sets. And the Petrolia house already reeked of wealthy industrial evil baron, and that was perfect for the narrative that they wanted to tell. And then they expanded on that. So again, using a setting, coming up, okay, we're going to recreate this set. We'll build sets in a soundstage, which is very extraordinarily common. So that way they can manipulate a camera, move a camera, light it any which way they want. And so this house in Petrolia, they looked at a famed couple's house in St. Louis as well. It was a castle-like Richardson Romanesque mansion, and Gothic interior touches intensify the atmosphere right down to wallpaper. And wallpaper was very important in the late 19th century. And they had these little devil motifs in it. And again, all of this can be seen because they captured it perfectly. And this is a great setting that plays a key that plays in a key moment, or a couple of key moments of this movie. And again, it's that haunted house vibe that, again, I think it just lends to ramping up some of the scares. So I thought that was really, really cool. And regarding, talk a little bit too about some of the costumes. So Ruth Myers is the costume designer here on Scary Stories. And it was Gamel's artwork that lit her desire to work on the project. So as I was like doing research and finding, trying to come up with interesting tidbits, dressing the teenagers for 1969, she didn't want them to, they had to fit in within not only just the time period, but also the feel of the movie. But really what she said, what Myers said was her coup de grace is that was dressing Sarah Bellows, who was brought to eerie life by an actor, Kathleen Pollard. And it started with a palette that matched what David Brisman was doing with the house wallpaper. So for Sarah, Guillermo always said he wanted a Baroque dress, but it turned that into a very Victorian straitjacket. So I'm very proud of that piece because it feels of its era, yet it's extremely scary, this brutal dress with its terrible chains. And so the straitjacket gown was a knockout for André Øvredal. Ruth's design, he says, allowed us to have this amazing moment when you first see Sarah and she emerges as a dark shape in the shadows, but then slowly you see what she's wearing is not actually a dress, but this worn down, complicated straitjacket. And I have to say that it really was pretty chilling. So you brought up, talking about practical effects, you just brought up, again, this is a scene that's right out of the trailer. We'll talk about her. I'll talk about her in just a second because as I'm trying to find what that character's name is, she had her own. She had her own. She had to go in for prosthetics to get this big zit, let's call it, on her face, and. She said, it started off as a red little pimple, but as her story goes along, it just gets bigger and bigger, and there's motion inside until a little spider leg pops through. And she said, as she's walking through the sets, she almost forgot that she would have it on. Then she'd look in a mirror, and it really scared the heck out of her. So and the actress was. Well, Kathleen it was Sarah Bellows. She actually played the sister to Austin Williams, Dean Norris.
It's Natalie Gansworth.
That's it.
Who plays Ruth.
Yes, it was Ruth. Natalie Gansworth was Ruth, and she had probably, again, it was another look. If you don't like spiders, that's all I'm gonna say. This scene is gonna creep you out. That's it. That's all I'm going to say.
I got to ask a question.
Yes.
Because up top, and I've heard this from a few people now, Guillermo Del Toro said that this is a primer horror movie. Mm-hmm. From this entire discussion, from everything you've mentioned, all the stories that are being told, from all the imagery, this does not seem like a primer horror movie to me. This seems like but the thing is, I don't know if it's not that scary or anything. I just think that I wouldn't go see this if I wasn't into horror movies. This looks terrifying. I think this doesn't look like a primer horror movie, is what I'm saying.
It is in the sense that what we have today as horror, and look, I think as a lover of the genre, we're in really great times for horror movies because we have bigger budgeted horror movies. It Chapter 2, for example, coming out a little bit later this year. And then we have Blumhouse.
Right.
And Blumhouse has produced some really good horror movies and then kind of B-level horror movies. But I will say, as far as this goes, this does feel like it's almost like a dark house ride at a really good fair or carnival where it's like a haunted mansion.
Do you think that the marketing did what he set out to achieve justice?
I think so. I think what the marketing accomplished was, for fans of horror, they're gonna go. They're gonna be in. I was in from the trailer, but here's the deal: it doesn't necessarily go. The movie is PG-13, so you're not going to get a lot of gore, and it's not gonna have the intensity, say, of like, say, James Wan's The Conjuring movies, right? It won't have that, there'll be a jump scare, but then the movie moves on. This jangly man character, while it's a scary image, but again, it's not unlike a haunted maze. And actually, a haunted maze is a great example of what I look at this as scary stories is. You're walking in a haunted maze. Number one, if you're at a Universal Horror Nights or anything, you're there to have fun. You want to be scared, but you're going to have fun. And even when you walk through a haunted maze, you're kind of waiting for someone to pop out at you and scare you. But once that happens, the catharticism is like you let out the sigh. And if you're with your friends, you end up laughing. Does that make sense? Like, you go through a haunted maze to have fun, to have a good time, but you go in to be scared somewhat. You're not so ultimately scared that when you walk out of a maze, you have a heart attack and die. But you come out with your friends going, wow, that was really scary. That was a good time. And a lot of people who don't necessarily like horror movies, they do go to these haunted mazes, particularly around Halloween. And I think as we're getting closer to Halloween, that's why I think this movie can be accepted as a PG-13. Now, would I take a 6 or 7-year-old to this movie? No, not at all. This isn't a kid's movie per se. Would I have loved this as a 7-year-old? Probably, because I was already watching some horror movies. Would I have loved it as an 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old? Absolutely. I would have had a really good time because at that point, I had already been in horror movies. And this movie, again, it really isn't meant to scare the bejesus out of you and have you go home like, oh, Jesus, I don't want to enter my house because it's so dark. But it wants to make you jump in a way that a campfire tale, like a good storyteller, will make you jump. So it wants you to have a little bit of fun. I guess, I don't know if I necessarily classify Gremlins as a horror movie, but you laughed at Gremlins, even though there were some horrific dark elements in the movie. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think I was a little put off by the idea that I think like for a primer horror movie, for people who don't typically go, maybe if the marketing was a little less intense, I'd be more apt to go. But I love the point you make about a Halloween time. People always seem to go watch horror films, even if that's not their typical jam. So exactly. I think that's a great point, and we're approaching that season, so we'll see what happens with the box office when people go up.
I'm glad you mentioned that because thus far, Scary Stories, it delivered. So it was in previews Thursday night, and it did 2.3 million. Which isn't too shabby at all. And this is actually coming right from Box Office Mojo. So 2.3 million from over 2,500 locations. So it compares to movies like the Escape Room and Pet Sematary. Now, one opened at 28.1, the other opened at 24.5 respectively. I can see this doing mid-teens, possibly 20. Again, I found it scary enough, but I do go to horror movies often. For me, the movie where it really worked was its atmosphere and its tone, and I enjoyed the monster aspect of it. And I could have been with someone. Well, actually, I was with someone. I was with, your friend and mine, who'll be with me a little bit later today, Kit, who's not the biggest of horror movies fans, but she enjoyed it as well. So I think that it does work in that regards, and it gives you just enough. I'll put it to you this way. I watched Supernatural, and there are elements of Supernatural that are in this because, you have this book that's controlling ghosts. You got to try to get rid of this book. Supernatural was violent, blood. It was creepy. This is PG-13 on a bigger screen, so it's going to deliver some more scares, but I didn't find it to be gratuitously violent and or gratuitously, gonna get that word out, gory or gross. So it is still very PG-13 in that regards. Horrific scenes, perhaps, but I think that all in all, these scary stories, they really did work. So I know the plan was to try to get some more sequels, to tell some of the other stories from these books. We'll see what happens. I don't know. Like I said, it will be fun to find out this weekend how Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark fares. I'm pretty sure that Hobbs and Shaw will most likely be number one. This is a smaller movie, but I think it's going to find its core audience. And I'm going to go another step further, Ryan. I think that as time goes on, more and more people, they're going to get into this movie, and it's going to make it on their list of horror movies to watch during October. Like, I have a list, and it grows. This movie, I'm going to add it to the list because I think it's good enough to do. So, there you go. I think that's, we can wrap up on Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Folks, audience, people, I want to say thank you. Thank you for tuning in. And if I may ask, if you're a fan, I love you for it. I appreciate it. Do us a favor. You're a fan of movies. Your social circle, I'm sure they're fans of movies. Talk to them about Anatomy of a Movie. Tell them, hey, if you like it, why you like it. Tell them they should check us out. Really appreciate it. Also, too, on your social networking, which I'm telling you right now, you're probably far more savvy at it than I am. Tweet out Anatomy of a Movie. Let everybody know about it, because I'd like to get more and more viewers and more fans. You can comment on what I talk about here on YouTube. I read the comments, and I'll even respond. Speaking of the social medias, you can find me on, right here, Popcorn Talk Network's Anatomy of a Movie. I'm a guest panelist, too, on Meet the Movie Press. And you can find me or support me on Twitters at Demetri Panos. That's it. At DEMETRIPANOS. That's my Twitter handle. It's my name. It doesn't get much easier than that. And isn't my Twitter on the tag to this?
We'll have it in the description.
You'll have it in the description, so you can just do that. Please support me on the Twitters. Ryan, how about you? Thank you very much for your help. Where can people?
You can find me at Ryan Nilsen at Ryan Nilsen NILSEN_.
There you go. So thank you again for another episode of Anatomy of a Movie. Stay tuned, because there's going to be more later on. You'll add Dora and the Lost City of Gold. Yes, Dora the Explorer is back. But thank you for tuning in to Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I hope I didn't creep you out too much. Take care.
From producers Maria Menounos, Kevin Undergaro, and the entire Popcorn Talk Network, we would like to thank you for tuning in. For questions or comments, be sure to visit popcorntalk.com. I'm Sir Richard Wentworth, and this has been a presentation of the Popcorn Talk Network.
The views expressed herein are those of the hosts only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Popcorn Talk Network or its owners or principals.